The morning Mae Underwood walked into Ira Ellsworth's land office with nothing but a prayer and a ledger full of debt. The dust of Caldwell, Kansas, was so thick in the September air of 1882 that a person could taste the earth on their tongue like a kind of slow, bitter communion. She had been awake since before the sun broke the horizon, sitting at the kitchen table of the small farmhouse that had once been her husband's pride and was now her heaviest burden, running her finger down the column of numbers that never once added up to anything good. Thomas Underwood had been dead for 4 months. Dead of a fever that started in his chest and worked its way through him like a fire through dry prairie grass, and before he had gone, he had whispered apologies into the dim lamplight of their bedroom with a kind of desperation that Mae had tried hard to forget. She had kissed his forehead and told him not to worry. She had been lying, of course. She had always known there was debt. She just had not known how much. The answer turned out to be $340. In the year 1882, in a small Kansas border town where a good day's labor earned a man $1.25, $340 was not merely a sum. It was a sentence. The debt was owed to one man. That man was Ira Ellsworth. Ira ran the largest land and cattle operation within 40 miles of Caldwell, which sat just north of the Indian Territory line, and breathed the particular kind of restless air that border towns always carried, part ambition, part lawlessness, part something harder to name. He had come to Kansas from Tennessee a decade earlier, when he was 28 years old, and he had built what he had the way most men built things out here, with relentless work and the occasional ruthless decision. He was known as a fair man by most accounts, which in the West meant he did not cheat you until you gave him reason to, and he had not yet found reason to cheat anybody. He was also known as a quiet man. He had dark hair that had started to silver at the temples, and eyes so dark a brown that in certain light they appeared nearly black, and there was about him the quality of a man who occupied whatever space he stood in without any apparent effort, the way a large stone occupies a riverbed, naturally, completely, and with no particular concern for the current moving around it. Mae had met him exactly twice in the years she and Thomas had lived on their 40-acre plot outside of town. Once at a church social 3 years prior, where he had tipped his hat and said nothing more than a courteous good evening. Once at the general store, where they had reached for the same bolt of brown calico at the same moment and both laughed, and he had let her take it with a small, composed smile. She had thought him handsome in a severe kind of way. She had thought nothing more of it, because she had been a married woman, and married women in 1882 did not think more of it. She was not a married woman anymore. She put on her best dress, which was dark blue wool that had faded at the elbows and the collar from too many washings, and she braided her brown hair back with more care than she usually bothered with on an ordinary morning. And she told herself this was not vanity but practicality, that a woman going to negotiate for her own survival ought to at least look like she believed in herself. She had 2 children to consider. Clara was 7, and still slept with a rag doll named Button, that Thomas had carved the face into on a Sunday afternoon 3 winters ago. Henry was 9 and had already started taking on the look of a boy determined to be older than he was, carrying wood and hauling water with a set to his jaw that broke Mae's heart a little every time she saw it. She could not lose the farm. She could not. The land office was on the main street of Caldwell, a wide-planked building wedged between the telegraph office and a hardware merchant, with a painted sign above the door that read, ELLSWORTH Land and Cattle, established 1873. Mae pushed the door open and was met with the smell of wood polish, leather, and the faint metallic bite of ink from the papers stacked in orderly rows across the large oak desk that dominated the room. Ira Ellsworth was standing at a tall map cabinet against the far wall, his back to her, examining a survey map with the kind of concentrated attention that suggested he had been at it for some time. He wore a dark vest over a white shirt, his hat on the hook by the door, and when he heard the bell above the entrance, he turned and looked at her with those dark, composed eyes, and she felt the strange, vertiginous sensation of meeting a man's full attention all at once. "Mrs. Underwood," he said, not unkindly but not warmly either, simply with recognition. "Mr. Ellsworth." She walked to the chair across from his desk without waiting to be invited to sit, because she had decided on the way here that if she sat down before he could offer it, she would retain at least some portion of dignity. She sat and folded her hands in her lap and looked at him straight on. "I have come to talk about the debt." He rolled the survey map with unhurried hands and set it aside, then came to the desk and settled into the chair across from her with the ease of a man who had conducted 1,000 such conversations and expected this one to be no different. He laced his fingers together on the desk. "I expected you would," he said. "I am sorry for the loss of your husband, Mrs. Underwood. Thomas was a decent man." "He was," she said, and there was a small catch in her voice that she controlled immediately because she had cried all she was going to cry in the past 4 months, and she was not going to cry in this office. "He was a good man and a poor accountant. The two are not always connected." Something in Ira Ellsworth's expression shifted slightly. Not much, not enough to call it amusement exactly, but something opened a fraction in the composed face. "No," he agreed quietly. "They are not." She placed the ledger on his desk, open to the column she had gone over 100 times. "I know what I owe you. $340, which includes the loan Thomas took for the seed purchase in the spring of 1880 and the subsequent 2 years of accrued interest." She watched him look at the numbers. "I cannot pay you in cash. I have $11.40 in the house, and once the autumn harvest comes in, if it comes in the way it ought to, I will have perhaps another $60 or $70, depending on the price in town. That still leaves me more than $200 short." Ira Ellsworth said nothing. He looked at the numbers with the same quality of attention he had given the survey map. "I have the farm," Mae said. 40 acres, and the house and the barn are in fair condition. The south pasture was seeded in August and the crop looks good." She drew a breath. "If you are going to take it from me, I need you to tell me now, because I have 2 children and I need time to make other arrangements, but I am hoping there is another way." He looked up at her then. His dark eyes held hers for a long, measuring moment. "What other way did you have in mind?" he asked. "I could work the debt off," she said. "I bake and I sew and I can keep accounts." Thomas always said my numbers were better than his, and from the evidence of his ledger, that is clearly accurate. "If your office needs work, or your household, or if you need someone to manage correspondence, I can do it. I am not asking for charity. I am asking for the opportunity to earn what I owe." There was a silence in the office. Outside, the sounds of Caldwell filtered through the thin walls, the distant hammer of a smithy, the slow creak of a wagon, a man calling out to someone across the street in the unself-conscious way people called out to each other in small towns. Mae Underwood sat very still and watched Ira Ellsworth think. He looked back down at the ledger. He turned one page, then turned it back. He was quiet for so long that Mae began to feel the cold creep of dread along her collar. Then he said, "I will accept another form of payment." Mae's hands tightened slightly in her lap. She waited. He looked up again, and to her surprise there was something almost careful in his face now, as if the next words required more deliberateness than the ones preceding them. "Your company," he said. She stared at him. "I mean to say," he continued, and he held her gaze with a steadiness that she found inexplicably reassuring even as her mind worked rapidly through what he might mean, "that I am alone on that ranch. I have been alone for 6 years. I have a cook and ranch hands and a housekeeper who comes twice a week, but I go home at the end of every day to a quiet house, and I have grown," he paused. "I have grown weary of it. I am not a young man who has time for prolonged courtship, and I am not a man who makes this kind of statement lightly. I am 38 years old." "You are." "I am 31, Mae said, because she suspected he was about to ask, and she had found over the years that supplying information before a man asked for it put her on slightly better footing. 31, he repeated. A widow with 2 children and a debt she can't settle in cash and 40 acres of land that is worth, if we are being honest with each other, probably about $200 in its current state. He held her gaze. I am proposing that you allow me your company. Dinner once a week to start. Conversation. The ordinary practice of 2 adults getting to know one another. He unclenched his hands and placed them flat on the desk. In exchange, I will restructure the debt into a payment schedule that gives you the time to settle it honestly, without interest, over 3 years. If at the end of our dinners you find you cannot tolerate me, or I find the same of you, then we part ways as business acquaintances, and your farm is secure for as long as you hold to the payment schedule. Mae Underwood sat very still and let the words arrange themselves in her mind. You want to court me, she said. I want to have dinner with you, he said, and there was something just barely there at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was the first cousin of one. What comes of it comes of it. She looked at him for a long moment. He was not pretending the proposition was something other than what it was, and she respected that more than she would have respected prettily disguised motives. He was not threatening her. He was not making demands. He was offering her a chair at a table, figuratively, and she suspected quite literally. 1 dinner a week, she said. To start, he agreed. And if I do not, she searched for the right word. If after a reasonable time this does not develop into anything more than 2 people having eaten together on a Thursday, then the debt restructuring stands regardless, he said. My word on it, and I will put it in writing this afternoon if you prefer. She considered him. She considered the ledger. She considered Clara sleeping with Button the rag doll and Henry trying not to look like he was frightened all the time. Yes, she said. Put it in writing, please. And yes. The first dinner was on a Thursday, 9 days after the conversation in the land office, and Mae spent the better part of the Wednesday preceding it in a state of agitation that she tried very hard to pretend was merely practical preparation. She asked her neighbor, Ruth Calloway, a stout, good-humored woman of 50-something who had lived on the adjacent 40 acres for as long as Mae could remember, if she would sit with the children for the evening. Ruth had looked at her with a particular expression, not judgment exactly, but the concentrated attention of a woman who processed information rapidly and drew conclusions at the same speed. Ira Ellsworth, she said, in the tone of someone turning a coin over in their palm. It is a business arrangement, Mae said. Of course it is, said Ruth, in the tone of someone who had decided not to argue with a thing they didn't believe for a single moment. I will be there at 5. Ira sent a buckboard for her, driven by a young ranch hand named Pete, who was perhaps 20 years old, and had a set of ears slightly too large for his head, and a cheerful, uncomplicated demeanor that Mae found oddly comforting. He helped her up with the practiced courtesy of a boy who had been told explicitly how to do this, and was executing the instruction carefully, and they drove the 4 miles to the Ellsworth ranch in the long copper light of a September evening. The ranch was larger than she had expected, though she had grown up hearing people talk about it. The main house was a 2-story structure of dark-painted timber with a wide covered porch that ran along the front, and in the early evening light it had a solidity about it, a settled permanence, as though it had grown there rather than been built. A cottonwood tree stood to the west of the house, its leaves already beginning to yellow, and 2 horses moved in the corral beside the large barn, and the whole scene had the quality of a painting in which all the elements had been placed with care. Ira was on the porch when the buckboard pulled up. He had changed from his work clothes into a dark coat and a fresh shirt, and he came down the steps to meet her with the same unhurried quality she had noticed in his office, as if he existed at a slightly different speed than the urgency of the rest of the world. Mrs. Underwood, he said, and offered his hand to help her down from the buckboard. His hand was warm and dry and large, and Mae placed hers in it with a feeling she could not quite name and did not try to, and stepped down onto the hard-packed earth of his yard. "Mr. Ellsworth," she said. He led her inside, and she was met with warmth and the smell of something roasting beef, she thought, and something sweet alongside it, and the wide, clean interior of a house that was spare but not cold. The furniture was solid and well made, the floor scrubbed, a fire already established in the stone hearth, even though the night had not yet fully arrived. A housekeeper whose name was Dolores, a Mexican woman of perhaps 45 with quick dark eyes, appeared briefly from the kitchen, assessed me with a single comprehensive glance, and disappeared again without ceremony. Ira poured 2 glasses of cool water from a pitcher on the sideboard. Neither of them was a drinker, as it turned out, and they discovered this at approximately the same moment when he offered, and she declined, and he set the whiskey bottle aside with visible relief, and they sat across from each other at a table that could have seated 12 and was set for 2. And for a moment neither of them said anything, and the silence was the particular weighted kind that exists at the beginning of something. "Tell me about your farm," he said. It was not the question she had expected. She had expected small talk, the weather, perhaps the cattle prices, something oblique and navigational. The directness of it caught her slightly off guard, and she found that rather than feeling exposed by it, she felt curiously at ease. He wanted to know the actual thing, not the social approximation of the thing, so she told him. She told him about the south pasture and the trouble with the drainage in the lower field, and the barn that needed its east wall rechinked before winter, and the milk cow that was old but reliable, and the kitchen garden that Clara loved and weeded with a proprietary determination. And she talked for a while before she realized she had been talking for a while, and looked across the table at Ira Ellsworth and found him watching her with the settled, attentive focus of a man who was listening and not merely waiting for his turn to speak. "You know your land," he said. "I have had to," she said. He was a dreamer more than a farmer, to be truthful. He had a great deal of optimism and not always an equal amount of follow-through. She paused. "I loved him very much, and he was a wonderful father, and he was also the reason I am currently $340 in debt, so one must hold both things at once." Ira was quiet for a moment. "I was married," he said. "Her name was Louise. She died of typhoid fever in 1876. We had been married 3 years. Me looked at him. There was in his voice when he said it a kind of compacted grief, not raw but not gone either, the way an old fracture in a bone is healed and still present at the same time. "I am sorry," she said, and meant it. "I was sorry for a long time," he said simply. "I am still sorry, but life goes on whether grief agrees to it or not." Dolores arrived with the food, and they ate, and the conversation moved through the rest of the evening with a quality me had not experienced in years. She had not, she realized with some surprise, had a real conversation of this sort since before Thomas got sick, perhaps before that. Not a conversation in which she was entirely herself, in which she did not have to perform a role or manage an expectation, but simply spoke and listened, and was spoken to. He told her about Tennessee, about growing up the third of 5 boys on a hill farm where the soil was thin, and the winters were brutal, and the only thing that grew reliably was stubbornness. He told her about the drive west at 28, about a cattle drive he had ridden with through the worst summer anyone could remember, about the gamble of the land purchase in Kansas that had landed right. He told these things not boastfully, but matter-of-factly, with the same quality of directness she was beginning to recognize as his most consistent trait. She drove home in the dark on the buckboard with Pete navigating the familiar road by moonlight, and Ruth was sitting at the kitchen table darning a sock when me came in, and Ruth looked up and looked at her face with the particular attention of someone reading weather. "Well," Ruth said. "He is a decent man," me said carefully. Ruth set down her sock. And I think I will go back next Thursday," said me. She did. The following weeks settled into a rhythm that me had not expected to find stabilizing, and yet did. Thursday evenings at the Ellsworth Ranch, and the rest of the week, the ordinary hard labor of her own land. The harvest came in better than she had feared. The south pasture yielded well enough that, when she brought the grain to the merchant in town in October, she came away with $68, which she delivered promptly to the land office with the quiet satisfaction of a woman whose word meant something to herself. Ira received the payment without making her feel either diminished or overvalued by it. He simply recorded it in the ledger and looked at her and said, "Your drainage problem in the lower field, the issue is a hardpan layer about 18 inches down. If you break it up before the ground freezes, you will have better water absorption next spring." She stared at him. "How do you know about my drainage problem?" "Pete drove by your lower field on the way to the mill last week," he said. "He has a good eye for land. I asked him what he saw." She should have been annoyed at this, perhaps. The idea of being observed without her knowledge had a slight intrusion to it. But what she actually felt, looking at Ira Ellsworth's straightforward face, was something else entirely. Something warmer than she was prepared for and more unsettling. "You were thinking about my drainage problem on my behalf," she said slowly. "I think about a great many things," he said, without any particular emphasis. She left the office and walked back down the main street of Caldwell with the peculiar sensation of a woman whose footing has shifted slightly, and who is not certain whether this is something to be alarmed by or grateful for. In November, the Thursday dinners began to expand. Not in any deliberate way, but in the organic way of two people who find the allotted time insufficient. He began coming to her farm on Saturday mornings to consult about the land improvements he had suggested, the drainage, the barn wall, the gate on the south pasture that had been listing since summer, and he brought Pete and another young hand named Carol, and the work got done in a manner that Mae could not have managed alone before spring. She provided coffee and food, and they sat on the covered porch in the pale November cold, and the children came out. Clara took to Ira with the unself-conscious directness of 7-year-olds, who have not yet learned the social management of their own curiosity. She walked up to him on the second Saturday and said, "Are you my mama's sweetheart?" Mae closed her eyes briefly. Ira crouched down to Clara's level with the unhurried ease of a man who was comfortable with children, which Mae had not known about him, and filed away with a feeling she couldn't classify. "I am working on it," he said seriously. Clara considered this with great solemnity, then said, "Mama makes very good biscuits. If you like her biscuits, that is probably a good sign." "I have had them," he said. "They are exceptional." "Then you are probably doing all right," Clara said, and walked back inside with the satisfied air of a negotiator who had reached a fair settlement. Henry was slower. Henry watched Ira from a careful distance for the first 2 Saturdays, with an expression that Mae recognized as the expression of a 9-year-old boy who is assessing whether a man is trustworthy, which is to say, he watched him with the same eyes he used when watching a dog he had not met before. Ira seemed to understand this without being told. He did not try to ingratiate himself with Henry. He simply worked, and on the 3rd Saturday, when a fence post gave him genuine trouble, he said to Henry without looking at him, "I could use a second pair of hands on this, if you have a moment." Henry had stepped forward and helped hold the post, and they had worked together for 20 minutes in near silence, and when the post was in and solid, Ira had said, "Good hold. You kept it straight, just that, nothing more," and Henry had nodded with the careful expressionlessness of a boy who was deeply, secretly pleased. The following week Henry asked me at supper whether Mr. Ellsworth was going to keep coming on Saturdays. "For a while yet, I think," she said. "Good," said Henry, in a tone designed to communicate complete neutrality and communicating quite the opposite. It was on a Thursday in early December that the quality of things between me and Ira shifted clearly enough that neither of them could plausibly attribute it to anything other than what it was. The evening had been ordinary enough to begin with. Dolers had made a venison stew and fresh bread, and they had eaten and talked, and after dinner they had moved to the sitting room where a large fire had made the room warm and golden, and they sat across from each other as they usually did, talking about the coming winter and the cattle market, and a dispute between two homesteaders on the eastern edge of town that Ira was being asked to arbitrate. At some point the conversation had arrived at the topic of loneliness, not directly, but the way conversations sometimes back into their real subject, through the side door of something ostensibly different. They were talking about the silence on the ranch in winter, how the snow muffled everything, how the nights ran from 4 in the afternoon until 7 in the morning and the dark was very dark and very long. "Do you not mind it?" me asked. "The silence here." She searched for the right word. "The large emptiness of it." Ira looked at the fire. "I did mind it," he said. "I have minded it very much for a very long time." He looked at her then, directly, with the quality of honesty she had come to expect from him and had come to depend upon more than she had intended to. "I mind it less lately." Me looked at the fire too. Her heart was doing something that she had not expected and was not prepared to manage with her usual composure. "Ira," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, which was not lost on either of them. "Me," he said, and there was in the way he said it something she had not heard in a long time, a particular careful warmth, like a flame shielded from wind. She looked at him. He looked at her. The fire crackled. "I did not come here thinking this would happen," she said honestly. "No," he agreed, "but here it is." She did not stay late that night. It would not have been proper. And propriety in Caldwell in 1882 was not merely custom, but the practical currency of a woman's reputation. But Pete drove her home under a sky so full of stars that the darkness between them seemed barely worth mentioning. And she arrived at her own dark farmhouse and let herself in quietly so as not to wake the children. And she stood in her kitchen for a long time in the dark with her hands at her sides and let herself feel it. She was falling in love with Ira Ellsworth. The recognition was not frightening. It was not convenient. It was not uncomplicated, given the way it had begun and the grief that existed on both sides of it and the practical arithmetic of children and farms and debt. But it was honest, and it was real, and Mae Underwood had always preferred the honest thing to the comfortable fiction. She was falling in love with him, and she was going to have to decide what to do about that. Ruth Calloway came to visit the following Sunday with an apple pie and a transparent pretense that she had simply happened to bake too many apples. And within 10 minutes she had extracted from me a fuller accounting of the situation than me had intended to provide. "He is a good man," Ruth said when me had finished in the tone of someone rendering a verdict. "I believe he is," me said, "and you care for him." "I am." Me looked into her coffee cup. "I am being careful." Ruth set down her fork. She was a woman who had married at 19 and buried a husband at 32 and raised 3 children alone and built something small but real from the rubble of that loss, and when she spoke from experience she spoke with the weight of things hard learned. "Me," she said, "being careful has its uses, but you can be careful so long that careful becomes a wall, and you end up very safe and very lonely, and those two things are not the same as happy." Me was quiet. "Thomas is gone," Ruth said, not cruelly but plainly. "He was a good man, you said so yourself, and he was not always a responsible one, and you loved him and you mourn him and you may mourn him your whole life a little, and that is allowed. But your whole life is also still happening, right now." Me thought about Ira's face in the firelight, the careful way he had said her name. "Yes," she said finally, "I know." December deepened, and with it the relationship between Mae Underwood and Ira Ellsworth deepened in the organic, undeniable way of things that simply are what they are and cannot be otherwise. The Thursday dinners continued, and the Saturday working visits continued, and by the 3rd week of December there was a natural, settled ease between them in the company of each other that had the quality of something earned rather than performed. The particular comfort of two people who have elected to be honest with one another, and have discovered that honesty, practiced consistently, builds something sturdier than charm. He kissed her for the first time on a Thursday evening in the 20th of December, which she would remember with the kind of precision people, applied to moments that marked the geography of their lives. They had been standing on the covered porch after dinner, looking out at the frozen yard under a sky crammed with cold winter stars, and he had said something quiet about the stars being brighter in winter, she thought because the air was clearer, and she had turned to look at him and found him already looking at her, and the distance between them had been so small and his expression so entirely unguarded, which was a thing she rarely saw on his face, the full absence of that composed reserve. That something in her simply let go. He leaned down, slowly enough that she could have stepped back and kissed her. It was careful and warm, and everything about it said that it mattered to him, that she mattered. And when they parted, she kept her eyes closed for a moment and felt the cold night air on her face and the warmth where his hands had been on her arms. "Me," he said softly. She opened her eyes and looked at him and said, "I know." He laughed at that, a real laugh, not the small, restrained thing she had heard from him before, but a full and genuine laugh that transformed his face and made him look suddenly younger and more open, and she thought she had never heard a sound she liked more. Christmas came with a light snow that softened the edges of Caldwell into something almost picturesque. Ira invited me and the children for Christmas dinner at the ranch, which was the first time the children had been inside the Ellsworth house, and the first time me had brought them there, and the significance of this was not lost on anyone present, including Ruth Calloway, who heard about it the following day and said only, "Good," in the satisfied tone of a woman whose predictions are being confirmed. Clara spent the first hour of the visit examining every object in the sitting room with the focused attention of an archaeologist conducting a survey, and at one point she held up a small carved horse from the mantel and said, "Did you make this?" "A man named Cutter made it," Ira said. "He worked on the ranch for 3 years and carved things in the evenings." "It is very good," Clara said judiciously, and set it back exactly where she had found it. Henry spent the afternoon in the barn with Pete and Carol, and came back inside smelling of horses and wearing an expression of subdued elation that Clara correctly identified as meaning he had been allowed to exercise one of the horses, which turned out to be true. He came and sat at the dinner table and ate with the good appetite of a boy who had been physically active, and at one point Ira said to him, "Carol says you have a natural seat." Henry looked up. "In the saddle," Ira clarified, "a natural way of sitting a horse." "Not everyone has that." Henry's ears went red. "Thank you," he said, in the compressed, careful way of a 9-year-old receiving a compliment that matters enormously to him. Me watched all of this from across the table and felt something expand in her chest that was large and warm and somewhat frightening in its scope, because it was not only her own feelings anymore. It was the possibility of something whole, something that had been broken for 4 months and had the shape of things that could be rebuilt. She did not say any of this. She ate her Christmas dinner and let the evening be what it was, and when Ira caught her eye across the table, the look they exchanged contained more than either of them had yet put into words. In January, a complication arrived in the form of a man named Garrett Booth. Garrett Booth had grown up in Caldwell, was a few years younger than me at 28, and had a land claim adjacent to hers on the western side, a small operation that had never quite prospered, and he had nursed a long, mostly unspoken regard for Mae Underwood that had intensified considerably since Thomas's death. He was not a bad man, not at his core, but he had the quality of some men in the West of having been diminished by circumstances, and having allowed that diminishment to sharpen into something that resembled grievance. He had seen me at the general store and at church, had noticed the buckboard going to the Ellsworth ranch on Thursday evenings, had made his conclusions. He arrived at Me's door on a Tuesday afternoon in January with a bundle of firewood that she had not asked for, and a manner that suggested the firewood was a down payment on something. "I heard you have been spending time with Ellsworth," he said, after she had let him stack the wood by the barn and poured him the coffee that courtesy required. "I have," Me said evenly. "He is not a man to be trifled with," Garrett said, in the tone of someone delivering a warning while hoping to be thanked for it. "I am aware of that," Mae said. "I do not trifle." Garrett turned his hat in his hands. He was not unattractive, sandy-haired, clear-eyed, with a lean build and good hands, but there was in him the quality of something braced, as if he was always waiting for the next blow. "Me," he said, using her given name in a way she had not invited. "I have admired you for a long time. Thomas knew it, I think. I would treat you well." She looked at him directly. He was not threatening her. He was not being cruel. He was simply a man in a position of wanting something he did not have and trying to figure out the angle that would help him obtain it, and he was doing it with more honesty than grace. "Garrett," she said, with the same quality of directness she had learned she preferred in all things, "I appreciate what you are saying. I believe you mean it. But I am not available for the kind of arrangement you are describing, and I ask you, as a neighbor and a decent man, to accept that with good grace." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see the calculation and the deflation occurring simultaneously in his face. "Ellsworth, then," he said. "That is between myself and Mr. Ellsworth," she said. He stood and put on his hat. At the door he turned back. "Just be careful, Mae. A man like that has his own interests." "All men have their own interests," she said pleasantly. "So do I. Good afternoon, Garrett." After he left, she stood in the kitchen for a moment and then laughed very quietly to herself, because the absurdity of being warned by Garrett Booth about Ira Ellsworth, a man whose straightforwardness and decency she had now had months to observe at close range, was genuinely funny. She told Ira about it on Thursday because she told him most things, which was itself an indication of how much had changed. He listened without expression, then said, "Booth is not a bad man." "I know he is not," she said, "but he is not what you need." It was said simply, without arrogance, as an observation, and Mae looked at him across the table and said, "No, he is not." The winter deepened. The Caldwell winters were harsh on the plains, the wind coming down from the northwest without anything to slow it, and the cold had a particular quality of relentlessness that tested the character of farms and people alike. Mae found herself grateful, in a practical sense, for the improvements Ira and his hands had made to her barn and the rechinked east wall, which held the heat for the livestock in a way the old structure had not. She also found herself grateful for him in a way that went far beyond the practical improvements, and she had stopped trying to temper or qualify that gratitude into something more manageable. On a Thursday evening in late January, she arrived at the ranch to find Ira on the porch despite the cold, sitting in one of the wooden chairs with his coat on, and a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, and a look on his face that she recognized as the look of a man who has been thinking hard about something for a long time. She sat down in the other chair without going inside first, because the porch chairs had always felt like the truest part of the evenings with him, the part where the formality dissolved entirely, and she pulled her coat tighter and said, "What are you thinking about?" He looked at her. The winter light on the plains in the late afternoon had a quality of extraordinary clarity, blue and cold and sharp, and his face in it was very clear. "You," he said. She waited. "I have been thinking," he said, in the careful, deliberate way he had when the words were important to him, "that I do not want to continue with the arrangement as it stands." Mae felt a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. He held up a hand very slightly as if sensing this. "I mean that the arrangement dinners, a payment schedule, a structured thing with defined terms feels false now. It felt sensible in September. It does not feel sensible anymore." He looked at her steadily. "I am in love with you, Mae. I have been for some time. I am telling you plainly because I am not capable of doing it any other way, and you deserve the plain truth before anything else." She looked at him. The cold air moved through the cottonwood tree beside the house with a faint sound. "I am in love with you too," she said, with the same plainness, because she was done being careful, which had been Ruth's advice and which had turned out to be exactly right. He exhaled. There was in it a quality of long-held tension releasing, and she understood that this had cost him something to say, that it always cost him something to be vulnerable, as it did most people who had been left alone for a long time by grief. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not as a settlement of a debt, not as an arrangement with terms." He reached across the small space between the chairs and took her hand, and his hand was warm against the cold. "I want to ask because I want to spend the rest of my life talking to you, because your children are remarkable, because you know your land better than most men I respect, and you are braver than any woman I have known, and you laugh at exactly the right things." He paused. "And because I am tired of being alone, and I think you might be too, and I think we could build something good." Me looked at their joined hands in the cold winter light, his large and rough-worked, her smaller but not soft farm hands, the hands of a woman who worked. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again, and this time she was smiling, and from the expression on his face when he looked at her smile, she thought that the word had landed somewhere very deep in him, in the place where the loneliness had been. He brought her hand up and held it against his mouth for a moment, a gesture more tender than any grand declaration could have been, and the cottonwood tree moved again in the winter air, and the light went on being extraordinary. They told the children that Saturday. It was me who told them in the kitchen of the farmhouse after breakfast, with Ira present but sitting quietly to the side, letting her lead, which was another thing she had come to appreciate about him, his understanding of where he stood and where she stood and the difference. Clara looked at me with enormous serious eyes and said, "Would we live at the ranch?" "We would," me said. "This farm would still be ours, we would keep it and work it, but we would live at the ranch." Clara thought about this with great concentration. "Would we bring Button?" "Absolutely." "And the milk cow?" "The milk cow would be very comfortable at the ranch," Ira said from the corner. Clara turned to look at him. "And you would be our father." The word fell into the room with a weight that nobody had quite anticipated, and me felt her throat tighten, and she saw Ira's jaw move slightly, a muscular response to emotion suppressed. "I would try," he said quietly, "to be the kind of man your father would have wanted looking after you, whether you want to call me father or Mr. Ellsworth or anything else is entirely up to you." Clara considered him for a long moment with those serious 7-year-old eyes. "I will think about it," she said, which was apparently all the commitment she was prepared to make at this time, and nodded as though the interview was concluded. Henry had not spoken. Me looked at him. He was looking at the table, his jaw tight in the way it got when he was working through something. "Henry," she said gently. He looked up. His eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with happiness or sadness specifically, but with the particular intensity of a 9-year-old who is trying very hard to feel everything the correct amount. "Will you still be our mother?" he asked, which was not the question she had expected. "Always," she said immediately. "Always, Henry, that will never change." He looked at Ira. There passed between them a look boy to man, tentative but direct, and Ira met it without deflection, without performance, simply with honesty. "I am not trying to replace your father," Ira said. "I know I cannot and I would not try, but I will be here, that I can promise." Henry was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with a careful dignity that was so like him and so entirely heartbreaking in its smallness, "All right." The wedding was in March of 1883, in the small white church on the east side of Caldwell, on a morning when the first suggestion of spring was making itself felt in the air, not warm yet, not by a long distance, but different, the cold beginning to have a yielding quality that the dead winter cold did not. Ruth Calloway was there in the front row with what she said was a piece of grit in her eye, and Pete and Carol from the ranch sat in the third pew looking scrubbed and slightly uncomfortable in their good clothes. Clara sat with Ruth wearing a blue dress Me had made her from a bolt of fabric Clara had chosen herself, and she held Button in her lap, because Me had decided to be merciful about this. Henry sat with his spine very straight and his chin up, in the manner of a boy who has appointed himself the man of his side of the church, and takes the responsibility seriously. Garrett Booth was there too in the back, because he was a neighbor and it would have been uncharitable not to invite him, and he stood when they stood and sat when they sat. And at the reception afterward, he shook Ira's hand and told me she looked beautiful, and he meant both things, and she was glad he had come. Me stood at the front of that church in a dress she had made herself from ivory wool with a small collar of cream-colored lace that had been her mother's, and she looked at Ira Ellsworth standing across from her with his dark, serious eyes and the rare full warmth of his face when he looked at her. A thing she had come to understand was not given to many people and was given to her, and she felt. In the midst of all the practical reality and the complexity and the grief that was still present somewhere in the back rooms of her, a bone-deep joy that was not about forgetting the past but about choosing the future. "I do," she said when the time came. Her voice was steady. "I do," said Ira, and there was in the way he said it the quality of a man who has thought about those two words for a long time and is saying them as the most carefully considered thing he has ever said. They moved to the ranch in April, when the ground was soft enough to work, and the world had its new spring quality of possibility. The farmhouse was rented to a young couple who had come out from Missouri and needed a start, and the income from the rental went toward the remaining debt balance, which by the following autumn was settled entirely, and me took the final payment receipt and held it in her hands for a moment before filing it in the office drawer. And she felt the particular satisfaction of a debt paid in full. Not the debt to Ira, because that had long since been dissolved into something entirely different. But the debt she had carried to herself, the obligation to survive what had looked unsurvivable. The first year of marriage was the way first years always are, full of the small adjustments of two formed people learning to share the daily fabric of life. They were both strong-willed and both accustomed to managing things alone, and there were evenings when the clash of those two qualities produced friction, real friction, the kind that required genuine negotiation, and occasionally the frank acknowledgement that one of them had been wrong. The first real argument happened in June over the management of the south pasture, which me wanted to plant in winter wheat and Ira felt would be better used for an expansion of the cattle operation. And they had argued about it with heat and clarity, and then sat in silence at the dinner table, while the children ate with the focused expressions of people pretending not to notice. And afterward Ira had gone out to the porch, and me had followed him, and they had stood side by side in the warm summer evening air, and eventually he had said, "The wheat income would be more reliable than expanding the herd this year, given the drought risk." "I was saying that," me said. "You were," he agreed. "I heard you better on reflection." She looked at him sideways. "That is a graceful way of saying you were being stubborn." "I was being stubborn," he said, without any apparent difficulty, which was something she loved about him, the absence of the male pride that prevented admission. They planted winter wheat in the south pasture, and the following spring it came in beautifully, and neither of them mentioned this, because they were both above that kind of accounting. Life on the ranch in the summer of 1883 had a quality that me would look back on from the distance of years as something like the best kind of ordinary, the richness that comes from the combination of hard work and genuine love and children growing, and an understanding between two people that is built on the foundation of honesty rather than performance. Henry had become, by that summer, Ira's devoted shadow in the way of boys who find in a man the particular combination of respect and patience they needed. Ira taught him to ride properly, not the way boys teach themselves by falling off repeatedly, but actually, with instruction and practice and the building of real skill. And by August Henry could handle most of the horses on the ranch with a competence that made Pete and Carol nod with genuine approval. He called Ira by his given name, not father, not Mr. Ellsworth, just Ira. And there was in this a kind of intimacy that was exactly right for them, the particular relationship of a boy and a man who have chosen each other not by biology but by something earned. Clara, with the decisive efficiency of a 7-year-old who makes up her mind about things, had begun calling Ira Papa sometime in May, with no announcement and no ceremony, as if it were simply the accurate word for what he was, and therefore the obvious thing to use. The first time she said it, at the breakfast table, Ira had paused with his coffee cup in midair, and there had been something across his face so quickly that me almost missed it, a flash of raw emotion, quickly controlled, the kind that lives in the place below the ordinary management of feeling. "Papa," she had repeated, referring to him to pass the butter, and he had passed the butter and said nothing, and later that morning me had found him in the barn and he had been standing with his back to her, and when he turned around his eyes were wet, which was a thing she had never seen before and which undid her completely. She put her arms around him without saying anything, and he held on, and the barn was quiet around them, and the morning light came through the cracks in the boards, and that was all. In the autumn of 1883, me discovered she was expecting a child. She told Ira on a Thursday evening. The day still carried a significance between them. The day of the week the whole story had properly begun, sitting on the porch after supper with the last warmth of September in the air. She said it simply, because they had always spoken simply to one another, and she watched him absorb it. His face went through several things very quickly. She saw the calculation, the practicality, the consideration of circumstances and implications, and then all of that cleared away entirely, like clouds moving off a landscape, and what was underneath was uncomplicated and luminous. He stood up from his chair and crossed the small space between them and knelt in front of her chair and took both her hands and held them and looked at her with everything completely visible in his face. "Me," he said. "I know," she said, smiling. "A child," he said. "Yes, our child." "That is generally how it works," she said, and he laughed, that full real laugh she had come to treasure, and he stood and pulled her up into his arms and held her there in the September air with his face in her hair, and she could feel the held fullness of his breathing, the emotion he was managing and not bothering to pretend he wasn't managing. Ruth Calloway, when told, said "about time," which under the circumstances me found both inexplicable and entirely typical of Ruth. The pregnancy progressed through the winter and into the spring of 1884. Me was strong and the pregnancy was not difficult, though the cold months required accommodation, and she managed the household and her account-keeping and the correspondence Ira had long since trusted her to handle, and she grew, and the winter passed, and the spring came. The child was born in April of 1884 in the upstairs bedroom of the Ellsworth Ranch house, with a doctor named Hartley who rode out from Caldwell and Ruth Calloway present, because Ruth's presence at important occasions had by now become simply a feature of me's life, non-negotiable and entirely welcome. It was a boy. Ira, who had been kept downstairs for the duration of the labor as was the custom of the time, came up when he was called, and he stood in the doorway of the bedroom looking at me in the bed, with the small wrapped bundle against her chest, with the expression of a man who has been knocked sideways by something he thought he was prepared for. Me looked up at him from the pillow, tired and entirely present, and said, "Come meet your son." He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the child, small and red-faced and squinting against the morning light with an expression of profound disapproval, and he was absolutely still for a moment, the way he went still when something moved him deeply. "He has your frown," me said. "He does not," Ira said without looking up, and me laughed, which made Ruth, from her chair in the corner, smile her particular satisfied smile. "They named him James. James Henry Ellsworth, giving him his brother's name in his own, which made Henry, when told, perform an elaborate display of indifference that convinced no one. Clara, when presented with James for the first time, regarded him with the scientific detachment of a naturalist encountering an interesting specimen. "He is quite small," she said. "All babies are," me said. "Will he always be this loud?" "For a while." Clara absorbed this. "I suppose that is all right," she decided. Button was loud at first too. This comparison to a rag doll appeared to satisfy her entirely, and she went off to inform Button of the new arrival in the manner of someone with important news to relay. The spring of 1884 passed into summer, and James grew, and the farm and the ranch together prospered in the way that two well-managed operations can when run by people who understand land and work. And the South pasture wheat came in well for the second year, and Ira expanded the cattle herd in a calculated way that proved out over the autumn market. And the debt, that original debt, the anchor of the whole story, was gone, settled, done. Me sat one evening in August at the desk in the small office Ira had made for her in the ranch house, going through the accounts, and she traced her finger down the column of numbers and found everything in order. And she thought about the morning in September of 1882 when she had walked into Ira's land office with her faded blue dress and her honest fear and her determination to save her farm and her children. And she thought about the way he had looked at her across that desk and said, simply and without manipulation, that he would accept her company. She thought about the extraordinary accident of it, the way things that begin as necessity can end as grace. Ira came into the office and leaned against the doorframe with the ease of a man comfortable in his own house, which was now also her house, and he looked at what she was doing. "Everything balanced?" he asked. "Perfectly," she said. He came across and looked at the ledger over her shoulder, and she felt the warmth of him against her back, and his hand came down to rest on her shoulder with the simple, habitual tenderness of a man who reaches for his wife without thinking, because the reaching has become instinct. "Good," he said. She put her hand over his and they were quiet for a moment in the lamplight. "Ira," she said, I need to tell you something." He looked down at her. There was something in her tone that he caught immediately. He had always been very good at reading her, which was another thing she loved about him. She looked up at him with a small, certain smile. He blinked. Then slowly comprehension arrived on his face. "Again," he said. "Again," she confirmed. He looked at her for a long moment, and the expression on his face was something she knew she would carry with her for the rest of her life. That same profound, undone quality she had seen when Clara said Papa for the first time, when he had held James for the first time, when she had said yes on the winter porch. He crouched down beside her chair and put his hands on either side of her face with an extraordinary gentleness, and looked at her with those dark eyes that she had first thought were severe and now knew were simply deep, capable of a depth of feeling that he had spent years not knowing what to do with. "Thank you," he said, very quietly. Not for the child exactly, for all of it she understood. For saying yes. For the Thursday evenings, and the honesty, and the farm, and the children, and the accumulated days, ordinary and extraordinary together, of a life built between two people who had both been emptied out by loss, and had found in each other the unexpected resource for rebuilding. She put her hands over his. "Thank you," she said back. James Ellsworth turned 1 year old in April of 1885, and the celebration was in the ranch house with Ruth Calloway and Pete and Carol and half of Caldwell. It seemed, because me had a talent for hospitality, and the ranch had the space for it. And Clara presented James with a carved horse that she had commissioned from a man in town, because she had remembered Cutter's carving on the mantel, and decided a horse was the appropriate gift. And James held it in his fat fist with the grip of a child who intends to keep a thing. Henry, who was 11 now and had grown 3 inches over the winter, and was beginning to look considerably more like the man he would become, rode in the cattle drive that spring alongside Ira and Pete and Carol and the other hands. A real drive, not a pretend one. And he came back after 3 days with the particular weathered, satisfied expression of someone who has done a real thing in the real world. And he told me about it at supper, with a contained excitement that barely contained itself at all. Garrett Booth had by that spring taken a wife, a woman from Wichita named Helen who had come to Caldwell as a school teacher, and had the efficient, intelligent manner of someone who would improve whatever she touched, and me was genuinely glad for him. She and Helen had become friendly acquaintances of the kind that formed between women in small communities, not intimate friends, but the kind of warm, reliable connections that made a place feel like a home. Garrett himself had softened into something more settled over the year, the grievance gone out of him, and he greeted Ira when they passed in town with a genuine, uncomplicated respect that Ira returned in kind. The summer of 1885 brought heat and good rain in the right proportions, which was remarkable enough on the Kansas plains to be remarked upon, and the crops were exceptional, and the cattle were fat, and the south pasture wheat was the best it had ever been. Me and Ira rode out to the pasture on a Sunday morning in late July, just the two of them. The children left at the ranch with dolers, and the summer morning big and golden around them. They rode side by side along the edge of the wheat field, the grain standing tall and heavy-headed in the flat light. And Ira's horse was an enormous bay named Reuben, and me rode a lighter-footed gray she had named Clover. And they rode in the companionable silence of two people who have spent enough time together that silence is as comfortable as speech. At the edge of the field where the land rose slightly toward a low swell, they stopped, and the view from there was the particular view me had always loved about this land. The flat reach of the plains in every direction, the enormous sky overhead, the occasional far geometry of another farm or a line of trees marking a creek bed, and the whole of it open and honest in the way that flat land is honest, hiding nothing. When I came here in '73, Ira said, I stood on this rise and I thought it was the loneliest landscape I had ever seen. Me looked at the plains. And now? He turned to look at her with the expression she knew best on him, that full, clear attention, the reserved man entirely unguarded. Now, he said, it is the most beautiful thing I know. She looked back at the plains, at the wheat and the wide sky and the unending light. Yes, she said, it is. The second child arrived in November of 1885, and this time it was a girl, which Henry greeted with the philosophical acceptance of a boy who had been prepared for either possibility, and Clara greeted with an enthusiasm so intense it was practically architectural. She had plans for a sister, clearly, plans involving considerable influence and instruction, and she began executing them almost immediately. They named her Rose Ira Ellsworth, and she came into the world with a head of dark hair and Ira's dark eyes, and a temperament that was, from the beginning, thoroughly her own. On the evening of Rose's birth, when the house was finally quiet and the doctor had gone and Ruth had gone, and James was asleep in his crib and Henry and Clara were in their beds, Ira sat beside me's bed in the lamplight and held her hand while she nursed Rose in the particular focused silence of new mothers. And me looked at him and at the baby, and at the room around her, the solid walls and the warm fire and the good lamplight, and thought about the morning 3 years ago when she had been sitting alone at her kitchen table looking at numbers that never added up. She had come to a man's office with nothing but necessity and courage, and he had offered her his company, meaning the simplest and most essential thing, the presence of two people choosing to know one another, choosing to be honest, choosing to stay. She had owed a debt she could not pay in money. He had accepted something else. And what he had meant by it, she understood now, from the depth of everything they had built. He had meant that the thing of real value was never money, never the arithmetic of debt and payment, but the harder and more rewarding currency of genuine human presence, of being known, of choosing and being chosen in return. Ira, she said softly so as not to wake Rose. He looked at her, lamplight on his face, all that familiar depth. I am glad it was you, she said. He squeezed her hand. His dark eyes were warm and entirely open to her, the way they had been since that December evening on the porch when he had said her name for the first time in that careful, shielded way, and she had understood that she was being offered something real. I am glad it was you, he said. Rose made a small sound against me's chest and Ira smiled. Not the rare, contained smile of the composed man she had first met, but the full, open, transformative smile she had worked to earn, and which now lived on his face with increasing frequency, as if joy, practiced consistently, becomes habitual. Outside, the November wind moved across the Kansas plains with its long, searching sound. And in the Ellsworth ranch house, the fire burned and the lamp burned, and the family it sheltered breathed together in the warm, ordinary miracle of being alive and not alone. James grew from a fat-fisted baby into a round, determined toddler with Ira's jaw and Me's brown hair, and an absolute refusal to be carried anywhere he could walk under his own power, which he exercised with considerable passion from the moment he mastered the skill. He followed Henry everywhere with the devoted, hopeless persistence of a small child trailing an older sibling, and Henry bore this with a gruff tolerance that fooled no one and was, in fact, tenderness in thin disguise. Clara, meanwhile, was conducting the education of Rose Ira Ellsworth with a dedication that me watched with equal parts amusement and admiration. Clara read to her sister every evening, and by the following spring, when Rose was only 4 months old and entirely incapable of following a narrative, Clara had read her 3 complete books because, as Clara explained seriously, the beginning is when you establish the habit. Ruth Calloway, who spent more evenings than not at the ranch now, because the farmhouse she had lived in alone for 20 years had grown too quiet, and the Ellsworth house had grown not quiet enough, and Ruth had decided her preferences lay clearly with the latter, had become a fixed and cherished part of the household's constellation. She and Dollars had established a working relationship of mutual professional respect, which in practice meant Dollars managed the kitchen entirely, and Ruth managed the opinion of what came out of it, and both parties understood the arrangement and found it satisfactory. Henry turned 13 in the spring of 1886, and Ira gave him his own horse, a young buckskin with a white blaze named Justice, and the look on Henry's face when he saw the horse in the barn that morning was a thing me carried in the front of her memory, available for retrieval on any day that required it. The boy's face completely open, all the careful management dropped, pure boyish joy and gratitude in undisguised possession. He thanked Ira with a handshake that turned, before Henry entirely knew it was happening, into a brief hard embrace, the arms of a 13-year-old boy around the neck of the man who had been present at every important day for the past 3 years, who had taught him to ride and to read a sky, and to check a fence post, and to hold his ground and to be honest. And Ira's hand came up and gripped the boy's shoulder with a steadiness that communicated every important thing without a word. When Henry stepped back, his face was carefully composed again, though his eyes were bright. "Good horse," he said, using Ira's name. "Thank you, Ira." "Good rider," Ira said. It seemed like the logical match. Clara, in the doorway of the barn, said, "I would also like a horse, just to be clear about the status of negotiations," and me said, "When you are 13, and Clara said, "That is 3 entire years," in a tone that indicated she found this interval deeply unreasonable. 6 more months before Rose can appreciate books, me pointed out, and yet you have been reading to her since November. Clara considered this. "That is a different matter," she said with dignity. "It is," me agreed. "In the summer of 1886 a drought came. It did not devastate them. They were better positioned than most, the Ellsworth operation having the reserves to absorb a difficult season in a way smaller holdings could not, but it was hard, and it required real management, and me spent a great deal of that summer at the desk in her office with the accounts and the correspondence, working out the arithmetic of where to cut and where to hold, and where the risk of expansion was justified and where it was not. She and Ira worked through it together with the same quality of partnership they had built in everything, arguing sometimes, agreeing sometimes, one of them occasionally being right when the other had been wrong and neither of them keeping score. The cattle came through. The wheat was thin but not a total failure. The tenant couple on the old farmhouse had a baby and struggled, and me reduced their rent for the season without being asked, which Ira noted without commentary, and which meant, she knew, that he approved. Garrett and Helen Booth on the adjacent western claim had a harder time of it. Their operation was smaller and their reserves were thinner, and by August it was apparent that Garrett was facing a genuine crisis of the same kind Mae had faced 4 years earlier, without quite the same mathematics. Mae brought it to Ira on an evening when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, and she told him what she had observed, and she said without preamble, "We should help them." Ira looked at her across the kitchen table. Then he said, "What did you have in mind?" "A fair loan," she said. "Real terms, a written agreement, exactly what you offered me. Reasonable interest, a workable schedule." She met his eyes. "I know what it is to be in that position. I know what a fair offer looks like from inside it." Ira was quiet for a moment, looking at her. Then he said, "All right." They went together to the Booth farm the following Saturday, and Mae did most of the talking, because she understood the particular difficulty of receiving help from a position of pride, and she delivered the offer in the plainest terms with the full weight of her own experience behind it. "I was there. I know what this is. This is a hand up and not a charity." And Garrett Booth listened to her with his hat in his hands and his jaw tight, and then looked at his wife Helen, who was watching me with the clear, direct eyes of someone who recognized honesty when she encountered it. "We accept," Helen said before Garrett had finished deciding. Garrett looked at his wife, and something in his face softened in a way that was visible even from across the room, and then he looked at me and then at Ira and he said, "Thank you, both of you." The drought broke in September and the autumn was good, and the Booths had their farm back on solid ground by the following spring, and the loan was repaid within 2 years, which satisfied Garrett's pride enormously, and which Mae and Ira received with the simple satisfaction of a circle completed. Rose turned 1 in November of 1886 and stood on her own for the first time in the parlor of the ranch house, planted wide-legged with Ira's absolute composure and Mae's brown hair, and a look of fierce personal satisfaction on her small face that Clara said was exactly how she herself had felt upon completing something difficult, which Mae found both plausible and entirely characteristic. James, at 2, responded to his sister's milestone by attempting to stand on the settee, which Dolores removed him from with the calm efficiency of a woman who had seen this particular category of attempt before. On the evening of Rose's first birthday, after the children were in bed and the house was settled into its good nighttime quiet, Mae and Ira sat together on the covered porch in the cold November air, wrapped in their coats and closed together the way they always sat on the porch in cold weather, side by side with the particular warmth of long familiarity. The sky over the Kansas plains was enormous and clear, and so full of stars that it had a kind of extravagance, as if the night were trying to compensate for the flatness of the land below by being absolutely limitless above. 4 years ago, Mae said, I was sitting at my kitchen table looking at numbers that told me everything was over. Ira turned to look at her. I walked into your office, she said, and I sat down before you offered me the chair. I noticed that, he said. I needed to keep something, she said, just something. I know, he said. I respected it. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she had never done in the first weeks of the Thursday dinners, would not have dreamed of, and which now was as natural and necessary as breathing. She felt the solid warmth of him and the familiar texture of his coat and the quality of his stillness, which was never emptiness but always presence. I did not think this was possible, she said. Not this, not something this full. His hand found hers under the coat fabric and held it. Neither did I, he said quietly. For a long time, neither did I. The stars went on above the plains, enormous and patient and very old, indifferent to the small, warm particulars of human love and entirely fitting as a witness to it. The wind moved through the cottonwood tree at the corner of the house, a sound Mae had come to love, had come to associate with this place and this life and this man, the way certain sounds become attached to the things that matter most. She thought about Louise, who had been loved here before her and who had not been forgotten. She and Ira had talked about Louise honestly, as they talked about everything honestly, and Mae carried a quiet regard for a woman she had never known, who had loved the same man and been loved by him, and had been taken too early, and who had left behind her a grief that had eventually, by the improbable mathematics of life, led him to a porch in September 1882 with an offer of his company. She thought about Thomas, who had been a dreamer and a poor accountant and a good father and a man she had loved, and who had apologized in the lamplight for the debt and the difficulty, and whom she had forgiven completely, not least because his impracticality had, in the end, brought her to a place that was better and fuller than anything she could have planned. The world makes its arrangements in ways that bear no resemblance to what we would have chosen, she thought. And then sometimes, if you are brave enough to walk through the door in front of you without knowing what is on the other side, the arrangements turn out to be exactly right. "Ira," she said. I love you." She said it plainly, the way they said everything, no decoration, no performance, just the direct, honest truth of it. He turned and looked at her in the starlight, and his face was open and warm and entirely hers. "Me," he said, "I love you." The wind came through the cottonwood again with its familiar sound, and the stars went on above the flat and patient plains. And inside the house 4 children slept their various kinds of children's sleep, Henry with his careful dignity, Clara with her plans, James with his fat-fisted determination, Rosa leaner with her new self-standing pride, and the fire in the stone hearth kept its warmth, and the lamp on the desk in the small office burned over the balanced ledger and the settled accounts. And everything was accounted for, everything was in order, everything was, at long last, more than enough. The debt was paid. The company had been kept. And what had grown from those 2 plain facts was everything. The full, warm, irreducible everything of a life claimed from the edge of loss and built, together, into something that neither of them could have imagined alone. And in the morning the sun would come up over the Kansas plains the way it had always come up, without ceremony, without apology, simply and completely present, and the Ellsworth ranch would wake into another ordinary, extraordinary day of it, of all of it, the beautiful, relentless everything of lives thoroughly, gratefully, deeply lived.